Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today for our dialogue on digital transformation in advance of the Network Readiness Index launch this year. I am very honored to introduce one of the folks I respect a lot and admire a lot for many years here in the US, my friend Larry Irving. Larry Irving produced the first empirical study proving the existence of the digital divide. The groundbreaking research sparked global efforts to begin bridging the digital divide, which continuously widely to be, and this study continuously should be widely cited today. He is part of the Internet Hall of Fame, and he was the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communication and Information Administration of NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration here in the US, during the Clinton administration. He also initiated hearings across the US to identify opportunities and obstacles affecting development of the nascent internet back in the 90s. So as you can see, we have a giant with us here today for our dialogue. So Larry, thank you so much for the opportunity and for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. The pleasure is all mine.
Very good. So let's just go straight to our questions today. So the questions here is they are divided in four main blocks. One is around the need for digital transformation and of course how COVID has impacted this need. Issues around inclusion, diversity, and the digital divide, a word you coined, and digital transformation and talent. So what are the skills we have to develop to really allow for people-centric digital transformation and for competitiveness and inclusion in this moment of that we are seeing so many bankruptcies going on, right? So what is the silver lining we see even in COVID, allowing for more inclusion? And finally, the fourth section, it's focused on digital transformation, economic development, and competitiveness, where we also gonna address the sustainable development goals. So the first question, Larry, would be, what are the primary elements of digital transformation that allow for a country and its people to survive and thrive during COVID?
I think the primary is making sure you have the basic infrastructure in place. People have to have access to affordable, ubiquitous broadband, whether wired or wireless. And in too many places around the planet, you either don't have the backhaul, meaning the fiber optic pipes, or you don't have the wireless connectivity, or people can't afford them. And in some places you have all three. We have to, the basics are having access, and then you have to have a computing device that is usable. And then training is also, and content are also helpful. If you don't have relevant content, it's hard to bring people online. And if people don't know how to use these technologies, and particularly emerging economies where, you know, in the United States and Europe, if something goes wrong with your device, if your network goes out, there are lots of places in the more developed economies where you can find somebody who can help. We don't have that infrastructure. We don't have the resilience that we need in emerging economies, and that is, to me, key to get to digital transformation. You can't get there if you don't have the network, if you don't have the content, if you don't have the training, and you don't have somebody to help ensure resilience at the local and sub-local levels.
Wow, I couldn't agree more, and I love this word resilience. So I come from Brazil originally, and as you see, as you know, there are a lot of languages there. So it's not just, as you said, content that's adequate and really attract those folks to the internet and make internet relevant, but it's also how can we provide that support and include those folks. So I think the word resilience, it's perfect there. So my next question to you is related, right? So does every organization or institution need to be digitally transformed to stay competitive and survive? And similarly, how COVID has affected the need for this digital transformation?
I think if you're not already ready, a digital pioneer, if not already a company that's embraced digital technologies, you need to start yesterday. The reality is, particularly in a world in which we have lost over 1 million people to this disease. We are telling people to stay physically distant. We've transformed education. We're transforming healthcare. We're transforming commerce. We're transforming interpersonal interaction in real time. Most of us would rather be in a physical institution for education. Most of us would rather see our doctor face to face. Most of us would rather be able to touch it, particularly Brazilians and Italians. You don't want to buy something you haven't touched, your felt, smell.
Yeah.
You don't prefer
And we
that.
are huggers. We are huggers. So
the tactile, we prefer all of that. But the reality is with the pandemic going on and with the threat of more viruses and other things going around the planet as the planet changes, we need to be more careful. We understand that. But even more so, we're learning things from using telehealth and from using teleeducation, from using telecommerce. Whatever you thought education was in 2019, I can assure you education isn't going to look like that in 2022. The same thing with regard to healthcare, the same thing with regard to commerce. We're going to move on from past ways of doing business. We are more and more of everything we do is going to be online. Those companies, those countries, those people that aren't online, that aren't thinking in a digital as part of their strategy, will not be able to compete in the years going forward, because we are there. We have crossed the Rubicon. We are in a completely digital era. 4 billion people have access. We have about 4 billion, 3.5, 4 billion people we have to get access to. But the 4 billion people who have access, they are the ones who are driving the economy, who are driving education, who are driving thought, who are driving how we use this. And there's some good news and bad news. You know, the air is cleaner in a lot of places because people aren't driving as much. We are learning new ways of educating. We're learning at our own time. We're doing work on our schedules rather than an enforced schedule. There are some things that are happening that are positive, and we're only 6 months into this new era. But I do think that anyone who doesn't have investment in digital, thinking about digital, figuring out how they're going to do what they do better using digital technologies, they're going to be left behind.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. That's so true, right? And I think at this point, there is no more excuse to not go digital, right? For so many years, we try to include people and serve communities in remote areas, including, right, with what you said, telehealth, teleeducation. So it's now or never, right? The governments have a challenge, but I think a great opportunity here with exactly what you were commenting. So I think moving forward to something related, which is inclusion, diversity, and the digital divide. Mm-hmm. How can digital transformation be leveraged then to rebuild these more inclusive, diverse, and equitable economies and workplaces in this post-COVID world?
One of the most important things that I just got off a conversation about this earlier today, we have to talk to the people who are the users of these technologies to make sure that they're included in the build out. This cannot be, and I hate this term, a top-down revolution. This has to be a community-up revolution. When we were in the early days of the Clinton administration, when we were first connecting schools and hospitals and libraries and ambulances and police cars and fire trucks and museums and all of these public institutions, one of the reasons we started with the public institutions was to get people in the community involved in the design, in the thought process. And we wanted firemen talking to teachers, and teachers talking to librarians, and librarians talking to museum heads talking to ambulance drivers, because we really wanted to get what should this entire ecosystem look like? How do people really use it? What's the right way to do that? As we're going through digital transformation, if we're really going to be inclusive, this can't be something that's imposed on people. Let's design with the user in mind. Let's design with the user in the front of the process rather than the back end of the process. If you have the user in mind at front and they're helping you design it in ways that's most useful for them, you don't have to go back and retrofit. One of the things we all have to think about, there isn't a major city, a major country, a major political subdivision on the planet that isn't going to take an economic hit because of this virus. We're seeing revenues decline, we're seeing taxes down, we're seeing economic commerce is reduced. So there aren't going to be as many resources we like. There isn't going to be as much money as we'd like. So we need to get this right the first time. We won't have time to go back and fix it because there won't be the kinds of investment. Depending upon what country or what region, some of this will be heavily government funded, some of this will be heavily private sector funded, some will be combinations of both. But no one has an abundance of capital right now because this pandemic has cost lives, it's closed businesses, it's cost jobs, and it's cost dollars. We have to do this. We have to do this right. It's going to be expensive. We still have 3.5 billion people to connect. And that 4 billion connected number is something of a misstatement of the problem, because many of those people are underconnected or barely connected. So even, here in the United States, which is, I know best, we define broadband as 25/3. You could not do what we're doing on 25/3. If you're not talking 100/100 symmetrical, you really don't have broadband in the United States. And I called for the United States to be, by 2020, to be 100/100 in 2008, before the Obama administration. I was asking our nation to make that investment. We're now 12 years down further. We're still at 25/3 as our baseline broadband. It's not really broadband, and yet America has better broadband than lots of places on the planet. We have a lot of investing to do. A lot of thought has to go into it. The good news is, the laws of supply and demand and technological innovation, as you deploy more, the costs do come down. As we deploy in the richer countries, we'll decrease the cost for doing some of the employment in some of the less affluent countries. But it is still going to cost billions, if not trillions of dollars, to connect all of the people we need to connect. We need to get about that job, because we're losing billions and trillions of dollars by not connecting people. I'll tell you one quick story. In the United States, we made a commitment to connect the world to the electricity grid in the 1920s and 30s. And so we were connecting America. And there's a piece of art in San Francisco by an artist that shows the day that Black Americans in Alabama got connected to the internet. So because of our country's troubled racial history, white Americans in Alabama had electricity 3, 4, 5 years before their Black neighbors. Think about the economic impact of looking down the street, and the same farmer, you're growing tomatoes and cows and pigs, and I'm in New York, I don't know what they do in farms, but think of all the things that happen in a farm. And one family has electricity in 1933, and the other family gets electricity in 1939. That 6-year difference is almost all the difference in the world in terms of that family being able to survive and thrive. We're doing the same thing with the internet. Connecting to the electricity grid had incredible economic consequences in 1930. Connecting to the broadband grid is going to have tremendous economic consequences in 2020 and beyond.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the example. It's very moving and extremely applicable. I see that even here in the region in Maryland I live, where you have a lot of kids that are not connected and didn't have their Chromebooks, right? So thankfully the government of Maryland really tried to work on that, but you still see a lot of kids being left behind. And the community through some school foundations are trying to help on that. So
Can I speak on? I mean, 1 out of 3 kids in America, 30% of kids in America, either don't have a broadband connection or don't have a computing device, or both. Most of those kids are low-income kids. Many of those kids are already at risk of falling behind educationally. In March, a lot of those kids fell out of the school systems. They didn't have the connectivity. They were already a year behind in reading or math, or maybe 6 months behind. And now they've lost an entire year. In the United States, we always have this learning loss, we call it, over the summer. You take 2 or 3 months over the summer, get some of the stuff you learn. So imagine if a kid has a 1 year because they don't have technology, because they don't have access. That number for Latino kids in the United States is 37% of Latino kids either don't have a computer or don't have a broadband internet. And the most horrible picture I've seen in terms of just heart-rendering, not horrible in terms of physical damage, but just thinking of a country this rich, what we're doing to our children. It was a picture of 2 young Latino girls in San Jose, California, sitting outside of a Taco Bell so they could have access to the internet and do their schoolwork. We cannot do this to our children.
Yeah.
But you multiply that across the planet, because I also saw a picture of a boy in junior college in Ecuador who was up a tree so that he could catch the wireless waves just right so he could do his work in Ecuador. We're seeing the same problem across the country, and you shouldn't have to climb a tree, and you shouldn't have to sit out on a curb outside of a fast food place in order to get an education on this planet. We have to do better by our children, and we have to better our children no matter what continent, what country. As I'm speaking to you, there are 500 million children out of school, out of 1.7 million school-age school children. 1 out of 3, almost 1 out of 3 children across the planet aren't in school right now. almost 1 out of 3. And most of those kids don't have broadband access, and they're disproportionately girls, and they're disproportionately in the global South. We have to do better.
We have to do better. That's very true. And I think I'm gonna cry for the first time in my digital transformation series.
I'm sorry.
No, you're right. We have to work hard to change this. We are in 2020. We cannot let this happen anymore. So moving forward in our questions, one of the issues, the core issues here is the role of government, right? We had a broadband plan years ago. Various countries had broadband plans. Nowadays, most countries do not have broadband plans, has a national strategy, right? So how should countries do better to really build a supportive ecosystem for this digital transformation? Because as you said, it's a matter of competitiveness. If one of the projects we work at Portland's Institute is the Global Innovation Index, in addition to the Network Readiness Index, and you see a lot of countries, including the US, going down on the index. And a lot of times it's because you are not including people, and those people cannot add to economy, right? We work a lot on accessibility issues at Portland's, and we see that how much the economy loses not including folks with whatever kind of disabilities or issues they might have. So what is the role of a government here at this point?
So there's a couple of different roles. One, I think there's a huge role for governments in terms of connecting public institutions, schools, hospital, libraries, community government centers to really robust broadband. So there are public places where you can get access to broadband. I think the second is create a regulatory climate or an investment climate so that people will make the investment that's needed. Third, I think, can be laboratories as to how to use these technologies in ways that are meaningful for the community, for the country. And fourth is a convener. Almost no government on the planet, including the United States, has the resources by itself to do what needs to be done. But by bringing together philanthropies, by bringing together thought leaders, by bringing together industry, and coalescing all of that power, you have a better chance of getting these things built. Yeah, I'm a New Yorker. Governor Cuomo is doing the Reimagine Commission in New York because of what's happened in New York with the pandemic. And you're looking at all of the different people that bring the Ford Foundation together, major employers, that bring together major foundations, and the government is there as a convener. And maybe a funder for some of these programs, but the government can't do it all by itself. Yeah. But the government does have the credibility, does have the ability, and does have the reach into the communities. The one thing I want to make sure is that as these governments are convening, that they're bringing all of the stakeholders to the table, including the stakeholders that, the folks who are the emerging economy. GoDaddy, the company, the online has a venture forward initiative that they've been focused on, and I love that program because it's about micro businesses. Well, the reality at one point, Apple was a micro business. The reality at one point, IBM was a micro business. I have a little right behind me. I've got a little globe from Hewlett Packard that started in a garage. It was a micro business. Micro businesses can start anywhere with anybody if we give them, if we plant them in a warm, sunny place and fertilize them and give them water to grow, micro businesses can grow anywhere. And we don't want to leave out folks just because they're not in technology today or using it well today. They could, with the right structure, do something wonderful tomorrow. Governments have a role to make sure that happens.
Exactly. Thank you. Yes, micro business and SME, small and medium-sized business, they are the backbone of so many economies. During a time I was in a company, I did a lot of work on a backbone in Africa, and it was very interesting to see how many entrepreneurs were coming together, like app developers and soft developers, to ensure that the government was acting as a convener and bringing not just technology, but this whole ecosystem to support their work, right? They had the knowledge, they had the creativity, but they needed this ecosystem. So very, very true.
We have a bias in the West also. One question, we have a bias in the West that it's, all the innovations happening. I was on a call with some students, American students last week, college students, and one of them said, why don't we see a lot of innovation from the rest of the world? And I said, there's huge innovation in the rest of the world. Kenya basically invented a whole new way of payment of things. There are things happening in Rwanda. There are things happening in Bulgaria. There are things happening across the planet. We don't just necessarily hear them here in the United States, but there is an entire marketplace happening out there. One of the most important things, I've just started reading it, Eric Schmidt's daughter, Sophie Schmidt, has a publication called Rest of the World. And I'm starting to read it because it's about IT developments in the rest of the world. And we've got to get over our biases. And I want to read it because I think there aren't, if you take Western Europe and North America, we've got what, 600 of the 8 billion people on the planet. That's not all the smart people on the planet. Maybe it's 700 million, but there are a lot of smart people on the rest of the planet. One of the things that Sophie is doing is putting those ideas that the rest of the planet is engaged in and making some of that wisdom available to us. And we can learn from them in the rest of the world, just as they've learned from us at the beginning of this internet revolution.
Definitely. No, thank you for that. I will definitely check that and also suggest to our readers. And it's very true, right? The beginning of the software and crowdsource and free software movement was all about bringing that intelligence, right? From anywhere to even at Portuland's, we are such a remote team. My designer is in like in one place in the world. The research associate is another. You have smart people everywhere, right? So how you bring that, and you are very right. It's very interesting to see how Africa and also India, they have perfected mobile payment much before America and money transfer, right? Transference of money. It's very interesting. And micropayments, right? Which is so relevant for these cultures.
People will use technology to solve their problems if you give them access to technology. I mean, it's not an accident. If you give a man a knife, and he's a butcher, he uses it one way. If he's a farmer, he's another way. If he's a painter, he does another way. If she's a teacher, another way. I mean, if you give people a tool, they will use it in a way that makes sense. An electrician will use it differently than a carpenter. And you give the person the instrument, and then you let them put it to the best and highest use. It's the same thing with technology. If you give people technology, help them understand how to use this technology, if it's new to them, they will figure out a way to how to make their lives better, easier, simpler. And different economies and at different levels of sophistication or the different products they're selling, we use it differently. That's a good thing, not a bad thing.
That's a very good thing. So just our last question and then final thoughts. I think you touched a lot on issues that nowadays, well, for some time now are identified as the Sustainable Development Goals. So how do you think, how can we make sure this digital transformation remains human-centric, remain ethical, and also keep the Sustainable Development Goals for everybody in mind?
One of the good things is access technology has become one of the SDGs, and we are now, it's incorporated. There was a time when technology was seen as something over here, and now it's central to all of these things. You simply cannot reduce pollution without using, you simply can't get more people access to water. You simply cannot reduce poverty without incorporating technology as part of the system. And so I think we're doing a pretty good job of putting technology, I used to be seen as kind of out there with my internet stuff, and now people say, oh, wait a minute, can you bring this in, can you explain this internet stuff so help me solve my problems? But there is one issue that we're not talking about as much as we should. And I've been working with a company out in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, called IT Renew. One of the things that happens is these data centers, we need a lot of computing power, we need a lot of data centers, and they have a carbon footprint. IT Renew is helping to create a circular economy so that we reduce the carbon footprint of this, of these new technologies. That's important too. We not only have to think about the use, we have to think of the consequences. And I think too often we get caught up in just the use. So I am glad to see IT at the center, but I also recognize that nothing is without consequence. In the same way that cars liberated us from, we didn't have to be as cruel to animals, we were able to move things faster, became more efficient, but cars have had an impact on our environment. When you think about computing power, when you think about processing power, you think about servers, they do leave a carbon footprint. And so we do have to be thinking, in all of these things, how do we reconcile all of the different questions we have to answer? So it's a long answer to a short question, but the first is, let's bring computing power, processing power, ubiquity, the ability to reach the rest of the world that IT brings into all of these problems we're trying to solve. But as we're solving these problems, let's also be aware that there is an economic consequence to using these technologies. Even if we're talking about, look, I've got three phones here. There's just right here, one guy, I got these 3 things, and then I got another one over there, plus this laptop. Well, how do we make sure we recycle them? Are we thinking about rare earth? Are we thinking about the degradation of these things and how to make sure that we use them in that we're thinking thoughtfully about repurposing some of these things. When I stop using this iPhone 11 or whatever this is there some child somewhere on this planet that doesn't have any iPhone at all that I can send this to? So, can we really create an economy where we're using these things smart and thoughtfully? So I've had 20 laptops over the course of my life, and I always try to give them to a school or give them to a library, give them to some enterprise that can put them, because my old laptop is a brand new laptop to somebody else. It's old to me, but it's new to somebody who's never had one. And it's a little bit of work, and I don't beat them up, but if they're physically still working, there's some child or some young family that can put good use to them. And we need to be thinking about that constantly as well.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting to see, that was one of my cultural shocks when I moved to the US over a decade ago, that in Brazil, you fix everything, right? I had a microwave that broke, and I was looking, okay, where there is a place I can fix my microwave, right? And there is none. And there are also very rarely programs to recycle and to ensure that there is a donation pipeline, right? For, as you said, devices that are actually still pretty useful to a lot of people. So I think that's something we all should be working more and more, not just in developing economies that have to recycle because they don't have access to devices, but also developed economies. So just final thoughts, and then it's it.
My final thought is, I've been working on the digital divide, digital inclusion, digital equity, all of these issues for 25 years. It's a shame that it took a pandemic to get the rest of the world as focused as it should be. But the reality is the world is as focused for the first time. We have the opportunity, those of us who care about this, of connecting the entire world, have an opportunity in the next 2 or 3 years to really make a dent in that 3 billion, but also to, as we talked about earlier, that 4 billion is a number that's not really real. There are people who connect to the internet, but minimally connected to the internet. So we have an opportunity to see something really profound happen. And we need to make sure that we keep the internet open and democratic and usable, and that it's a force for empowerment and for people to be their best selves, as opposed to a tool of oppression and surveillance and degradation. And that's up to us. Those of us who are internet pioneers, those of us who care about this technology, the next 3 to 5 years will be telling, and we have to be focused on making sure that we're using the internet for its highest and best purposes to give people the best lives they can have. And if we're not careful, we could lose that dream.
Very, very, it's a extremely important moment to make sure we are all getting this right. So Larry, thank you so much. This was an incredible interview. I thank you again for your time and for all the knowledge and teachings. I'm gonna make sure that I post some of the resources you mentioned. There is an incredible matrix that I was very happy when the ITU published, which was exactly the matrix combining the WSIS lines with the SDGs, which actually you brought up in one of your answers. But again, thank you so much.
And one concluding thing?
Sure, go ahead.
One of the things that also gives me hope is there are people like Doreen Bogdan, who I used to work with, who's now at Development Bureau at ITU, and Fabrizio Hochstein, who's at the UN. There are so many people, Fabian Casper, Sonia Jorge at the Alliance, Tim Berners-Lee. What gives me hope when I get up in the morning is that I know there are people who they spend all of their day, every day, thinking about this and only these issues and trying to work to make this a technology that is usable for everybody on the planet in a way that we would want people to use these technologies, not to oppress, not to harm, not to malign, not to harass, but to live their best lives. So, when you look at the Giga Network, look what UNICEF is doing, look at all of these important and powerful things, not enough people know about them. It is important that people know about them. It is important that people support them. It is important that people lean forward. Here in the United States, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance with Laura Breeden and Andy Seifer. There are so many incredible resources, and we need to support the folks who are doing this hard work. I'm no longer doing it, 100% of my time, but I do give whatever support I can intellectually, and then even some, donations to some of these organizations that are nonprofits, because it matters. So for people who matter, they need to know these things are out there. They need to know there are really smart people with good intentions who are trying to make this the best digital planet we can have.
That's wonderful. And we have interviewed some of them. So I'm glad we reach out some of them. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And please keep in touch.
Please, and vice versa.